You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 75. I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Paul Zimmerman. On today's show, we talk about illustration in archaeology in a recent article in the Journal of Field Archaeology. Let's get to it. All right, welcome to the show, everybody. Welcome, Paul. How's it going?
It's going pretty good, Chris. How are you doing today?
Pretty good, pretty good. I think last time we mentioned episode 74 was going to be your last broadcast because you were headed to Brooklyn or something like that in a practical snowstorm. So apparently you made it out all right.
Yeah, that snowstorm ended up fizzling out here. Just north of the city, we had 1.5 feet, 2 feet of snow, and it was nice because I went up to Vermont for the weekend and went skiing on 2 feet of fresh powder. But yeah, the city mostly just kind of slushed all day.
Nice. Well, I had decent weather this weekend myself, which was good because I had a 9 to 11 hour drive, depending on how many times you stopped, down to San Diego last week because we're recording this in early March. I went to the Society for California Archaeology meeting, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because, as you guys know, I am now a sales representative. I think they call me a CRM specialist or something like that, CRM sales specialist or something, whatever my fancy title is, for WildNote, which we've talked about, and I think was even my app of the day on the last no, I talked about PhotoScan a couple episodes ago. It was my app of the day. And
yeah, it was a couple episodes ago.
Yeah, and also for the first time, and I didn't plan this because I booked this before I started working with WildNote, and it just so happened they were going to this conference as well. We were going to go anyway, regardless. But I had a booth for the Archaeology Podcast Network there. And so I called up the organizers and had them put the booths right next to each other, which was great. So the APN had a nice corner booth because I've got this huge backdrop that really fits well in the corner. And then WildNote right next to me. So I was pretty much standing in the middle of those two, and between recording interviews in the little ad hoc studio we set up right in the conference room there, or in the exhibit hall, with 2 microphones and my H6 ready to go. I was going between there and the WildNote booth, and I was on one side explaining to people what podcasts are and how you subscribe to them, and then I'd turn around and explain to people what digital archaeology is and how you do it and how WildNote can help take you there. And then I turn around and explain podcasts again, and I turn back around and explain digital archaeology again. It was very confusing sometimes.
It sounds like a lot of fun, though. How many people were you talking to? How many people were there?
I don't have final numbers on the conference, but it seemed really well attended to me. For the 2.5 days that the exhibit hall was open, I mean, it was just a constant stream of people through there. I would say, this is still just a regional conference, but it is one of the bigger ones. I would say they probably had between 600 and 1,000, just guessing, based on the numbers that I saw. But I should get some real numbers from them, because we took in, like I said, it was a constant stream of contacts, and it was great. Since we've talked about WildNote before, the only thing I want to mention really on this show, and the reason I'm mentioning this conference, is because something I noticed is something I didn't think I would notice for a while, and I'm glad I did. But I didn't think I'd notice this for a while at a smaller conference like this. But at the SAAs, we'll often see at least a handful of people trying to do something in the digital app space for archaeology. A lot of it is based around excavation. Not very many things are based around survey, basically, the first part of the archaeological process. And one of the first to come on the market, not to come on the market, but really to have a consistent presence at the SAAs was Codify. And of course, up until last year, I was working for Codify. And now I'm with WildNote, and another kind of player in the space that's always been there was called Archaeolink, and he now goes by Interis, which I might talk about later because he gave me a demo version of the software for me to play with, so I'll probably be talking about that later. But Interis really does focus more on the, formerly Archaeolink, really does focus on the, excavation side of things, and a really heavy, robust data structure that is actually kind of complicated to get your mind wrapped around how to use it and how it's going to work. But what they don't have is a really robust intake structure. So, we're talking to them about that. But either way, the thing that I was so encouraged by that I wanted to mention is that there were 3 companies at a small conference where there were only maybe 20 exhibitors total. 3 of us were about digital data collection and storage. And that is kind of amazing to me. It's amazing that it took until 2018, and it's amazing that it's happening all at the same time. So I just really love that. I have no sort of animosity towards Codify that we mentioned before. I am so glad that they were there and they had their new Codify California thing out, because this competition, giving people choices, is just going to make everything better. And in the end, the real winner is going to be history, and the way that we record history, and the way that we're able to access it later in the future for people to understand. So it was just an awesome thing to see all that there, and not just the book dealers and the the trinket sellers and the people like that that are always at these conferences. So.
Do you feel like with digital recording that we're actually reaching kind of an inflection point here, where the ubiquity and the quality of what's available is suddenly noticeably better than it had been in the past?
That's hard to say, because no one's really nailed it yet. So there isn't like a metric to measure that by yet. Plenty of companies are doing their own solution, and they're either happy with it or they're not. I don't really know. But as far as, even Codify had a date that was beyond what we were at the conference, where you could actually use what they were saying they had. They were demoing it. I'm not sure what they were demoing, but it's not something you can just go buy, you can buy it, they'll take your money, but it's not something you can go buy and use in the field like right now in its fully fleshed out 100% ready form. And full disclosure, neither is WildNote. We showed up to the California meeting with California DPR forms. That's the site recording suite of forms that they have here in California. We showed up with that, but to be fully honest, and we told people this, the actual real full 100% PDF export is probably not going to be ready until sometime in April, because it's a really hard problem to solve. Now, you can do full data collection, you can do full data export as raw data right now, and with limited PDF export. But I don't think we can be at an inflection point until we've got multiple players in the business that are just like, here are all your fully fleshed out, ready to go options. You know what I mean? The simple fact that we don't actually have one of those yet is also kind of a stunning statement to make. But I think 2018 is the year that's going to be true. I think Codify is going to nail it. I think WildNote's going to nail it. And I think as we start taking over the space, I think other people are going to jump in, and maybe some of these solutions that other companies have paid for privately, as they notice their market advantage starting to erode with their internal only solution, they might go to market with their own solution. They might try to sell that to other people. And then that's when I think we'll be at an inflection point, is when all these company solutions go to market and they stop being internal. That, I think, is going to be the real game changer right there. Mm-hmm. So who knows? Anyway, that was fun.
Well, it is. That's interesting. That's where we were 20 years ago in Masco with sitemap surveying softwares, that we were really close to bringing it to market. It got tied up in the university, which was really geared towards any product at the time was going to be something that revolutionized, medicine or engineering or something that was going to bring in millions of dollars, and we weren't looking at anything like that. So we got bogged down in the paperwork in the university before everybody realized that it wasn't. They didn't have any structures in place for a project like ours, but it was really close for a long time. Where we had a very good product, we felt, and we could use it on a lot of sites, but the conversations that we had to have with people and the training that we had to have with them in order for them to be able to use the product were real hurdles that we could never quite get across. And it seems like that's that last little bit right there that a lot of different projects are stuck on. They converting what they're able to use by themselves into something that they can hand off to somebody else with minimal training, and have somebody else then use successfully on their project. That's the real trick. And so, I'm curious if we're now really close, really close to having somebody actually crack that nut.
Yeah, I think we are. And I'd like to go back and maybe interview some people in the business about when that was true for GPS, because, when the government, I think it was 2000 or 2001, the U.S. government flipped the switch on GPS that was always available and said, okay, we're removing the arbitrary restrictions we had on accuracy. Before, consumer GPS,
selective availability.
Yes. You needed special equipment to bring the accuracy down to what it was actually giving you. Otherwise, if you weren't part of the military or some other special group that was able to get that level of that really kind of sub 3 meter accuracy, it was way bad. Like, it was unusable bad. And that's why the consumer market just never really developed GPS. And then when they flipped that switch, it was really just turning that off. And all of a sudden, boom, GPS just blew up. And what I'm wondering is, what was the adoption cycle like for government agencies? Because it would be government agencies that mandate a certain accuracy standard for GPS, and then companies would have to figure out a way how to meet that standard. And the way to meet that standard is obviously get your own GPS and make sure it's got that level of accuracy. When did that become standard operating procedure? When did it become people would come to your company and they're just like, where's my GPS? Not, oh, are you guys using GPS? That's where we're at with digital archaeology right now. It's like, oh, neat, you guys have tablets. What app are you using? That's kind of where we're at right now. I mean, that's better than where we were 3 years ago when somebody would be like, what is this tablet? I don't understand this thing. But now we're like, oh, cool, you guys are using tablets. I think that's where most companies are at if they are using tablets. If they're not, some of the younger field techs might be like, why are we doing this on paper? And that's where we're at now. But when is it going to be just accepted that you have tablets or phones, whatever the case may be? I think phones personally is going to win out the day on just basic recording. But when is that going to be the case for digital archaeology? I have no idea. I think personally it's going to be probably by the 2020 field season, maybe 2 years. Because I think this is the year, like I said, that we actually nail it, and there's going to be a go-to solution across the country from multiple companies, whether it's WildNote and Codify or somebody else. I don't know. But I think this is the year that that's going to happen. I think it'll take another year because people are hungry and they want to win projects. So there's going to be a lot of early adoption once it's completely nailed. And I think the next year, maybe the year after that, it's going to take before new people in the field are just handed a tablet, and that's the way it goes.
Well, it's interesting comparison against GPS, because GPS became popular in big part not because of the scientists that wanted to use it, but because it had use for people, for recreation, for sports, for navigation really quickly. I mean, how soon did a GPS has become a thing in cars? That happened fairly quickly once that selective availability was dropped. And tablets in the field are kind of going the opposite direction. We have tablets which were consumer goods, and they're trying to push into a scientific space, or we're trying to bring them into a scientific space more and more. And the friction that we have is a different kind of friction. Again, I think that somebody's going to figure out how to make the right data collection and analysis tools that are available that are easy enough for other people to use on their projects. But it's interesting because I haven't, I haven't spent nearly as much time around it as you have, and I haven't gone to things like the SCA. So I don't see this firsthand, but I've got to believe that it's getting really, really close.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up a great point, Paul, because I'd like to just be a fly on the wall at one of these other conferences around the country, because my only experience, honestly, is the conferences I've obviously been to, and I have seen no one else there. When Codify started going, there was literally nobody else doing it. The only other exception is one other time, my very first app development adventure, before I before I actually joined Codify for a while, was a company called Field Notes that I had helped set up with another guy. I had an investor who was also an archaeologist, but I don't know where he got all his money, but he was pumping the money, and we were having something just created, an iOS and Android app in tandem. We were having something created from the ground up to do archaeology site recording. That fell through because the expense got too high, and he backed out, and I didn't have another investor, so blah, 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 that died. However, I think it was in Austin, Texas, because I think I drove there. Yeah, I think it was in Austin that we actually had a booth at the SAAs, a digital site recording booth, and almost nobody stopped by. I mean, the SAAs is massive, but people didn't really understand what we were doing. This was probably 4 or 5 years ago, and people didn't understand. They didn't even get why we were there. Like, we'd have to show them, and I'd had all these tablets laying out on the table, and this is what we're doing, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't really even have anything to show them, quite frankly. I had promises and hopes and dreams to show them, but we weren't even we were barely starting the development phase on what we had. So even if I'd shown them anything, it would have changed completely in the next 4 months as we move through development. And but that was only 4 or 5 years ago. So if you went to, say, the Eastern Conference, or there's a Northeastern Archaeology Conference, I think, up there somewhere, I'd like to see if there's anybody in the exhibit hall. Is there anybody there? If Codify or WildNote doesn't go to that conference, is there actually anybody there that has an in-field data recording solution that they're trying to get off the ground or already have off the ground? If they do, they're not very popular, or they're not very vocal on social media, because I don't know they exist. So right now it's kind of a California thing. I don't know if that's because, I don't know why. That's kind of weird that both WildNote and Codify are both based in California, but who knows?
A little closer to Silicon Valley, maybe.
Well, Codify is almost exactly in Silicon Valley. It's just an hour or two north of there. Yeah. It's in the Bay Area. So, yeah. Well, anyway, it's a very encouraging time to be doing archaeology. I think we're definitely, like you said, Paul, we're approaching that inflection point where everything's going to change. Everything is going to change. And when that changes, that real solid flip to digital archaeology, I think a lot of other things, it's going to be our gateway drug to a lot of other tech that we can bring into the field once we develop that new generation that just expects tablets, they expect digital recording, and they don't know any different. That's the kind of person I want to work with in 10 years, is the person that has never not worked with a tablet. So the world that we're going to be recording in that space is going to be pretty amazing, I think, because they're going to be like showing up with their AR glasses on and, doing all kinds of crazy things because they're just used to it. So that'd be pretty awesome.
Well, I like actually where you left that there, talking about digital recording, because I think that'll be a segue into our next segment. We both read a recent article in JFA, February 5th. So this is just only a month old, by Colleen Morgan and Holly Wright. The article is called Pencils and Pixels, and it discusses that same idea very specifically with regard to illustration, to drawing in archaeology. And it's a wide-ranging sort of literature review, but it does document how things have changed and how things have stayed the same between when everything was being drawn by hand to various digital recording techniques. And so I think that we might be seeing, another transition like that within our field, using, again, another suite or whole variety of different kinds of digital techniques and digital recording devices that are going to just they're going to alter the landscape. All right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is a great segue, and I'll just add to that as we end this segment here. Nobody's working on that. Like WildNote and Codify both require you to, if you're going to sketch something on your tablet, or you're going to bring in a sketch that was either scanned or whatever that was done on paper, either way, if you're going to bring it into the system, it has to be brought in basically as a document or photograph. And because working on drawing tools is a completely separate app development scheme, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a whole other app that you have to make basically within your app to do drawing. It's got different tools, it's got different exports, it's got all this stuff. So I think they're both saying right now, just because it's really hard and really expensive, why reinvent the wheel? There's plenty of drawing apps out there that you can use, and that's what I want to focus on at least one of the next two segments, because I try to develop everything in tandem. I want to at least develop the workflows, if not the applications. So while I've been thinking about all this digital site recording, I also think about drawing things digitally and doing other things digitally as much as possible. And that's what we'll bring up in the next segment. Because that's the thing. Even if we switch to tablets, like I said a few minutes ago, by the next 2 years, it's going to be another hurdle to get over, to get people to drop their pen and paper when they're drawing artifacts, when they're drawing sites, when they're drawing features, when they're drawing profiles, whatever it is. For them to just lay that stuff down and use a tablet, that is a whole other conversation that I think people aren't even thinking about. Everybody seems to know that we need to record digitally. They just don't know how to do it. But then when you say, "Oh yeah, you should be drawing digitally too," they're like, "What? That's still a few more years away, I think, conceptually, for most people to just wrap their heads around." But we'll pick this up on the other side of the break and really dive into this article.
This network
network is supported by our listeners. You can become a supporting member by going to arcpodnet.com/members and signing up. As a supporting member, you have access to high-quality downloads of each show and a discount at our online store, and access to show hosts on a members-only Slack team. For professional members, we'll have training shows and other special content offered throughout the year. Once again, go to arcpodnet.com/members to support the network and get some great extras and swag in the process. That's arcpodnet.com/members.
All right, welcome back to Archaeotech episode 75, and we kind of got off on a little bit of a tangent on the first segment, which is great. I think it sounds like we're going to just not do our App of the Day segment because we want to talk about this illustration in archaeology and drawing and things like that and digitally. Using this article that Paul mentioned at the end of the last segment called Pencils and Pixels, Drawing and Digital Media in Archaeological Field Recording by Colleen Morgan and Holly Wright from the Journal of Field Archaeology. We will have links to this article in the show notes, so go check that out if you want to follow along. And if you're using a podcast player, you should be able to look right on the screen there and see the link right there. It should be clickable, so if you're not driving, don't do this if you're driving, but if you're just sitting somewhere or listening to us or whatever, then click on that and you can probably see this article. I think that will work. Paul, like you said, this article was largely a literature review on what's been done in the past, which is, I guess, a good place to start because, like I said, thinking about recording digitally in the field is only now becoming a little bit more standard. We just don't know how to do it yet. We're trying to come up with these solutions, but drawing, we're not even close to talking about drawing. And so starting with Colleen and Holly's article like this with sort of all right, here's where we came from and here's where we probably should be going is probably a good place to start even in 2018. I'm surprised something like this isn't 5-10 years old, but that's where we're at. So you definitely read this article, Paul. What's your initial first thoughts on this thing?
My first thoughts, again, I said it's like a literature review. You said that too. It's it is a literature review. Excuse me. It kind of had a sort of a feeling of being, I don't know, a grad student's project about something about illustration in archaeology. It's not a how-to at all. It does go into some more philosophical discussion toward the end, which is, in my opinion, is the most valuable part, unless you're really interested in finding out what the authors think about what other people have said about, say, Pitt Rivers drawings. It's very it's very much centered on British archaeology, which makes sense. They're both from University of York. Actually, Morgan is. I'm not sure if Holly Wright is associated with York or just with the Archaeological Data Service, ADS. Anyhow, they're both they're both based abroad across the pond now. But it describes some different techniques, not in detail, not so that you'll learn how to do these various kinds of drawings, but how the evolution of different kinds of section drawings, different kinds of plan drawings, how they are annotated, how they were published, who creates them, when and why, what kinds of things are being recorded, and some of the ins and outs, as well as historical discussions of the ins and outs of these various kinds of drawings in ways. And I thought that, for me, it was really interesting to read for the history of it, but also because it just reminded me of so many things that I've dealt with drawing over the years and photographing over the years. When I first decided I was going to go into archaeology, I was an anthro undergrad, and the archaeology courses were the ones that really interested me most. So in the summer after I graduated, I went and I took a number of different archaeological tech courses, right? So I went to UCLA and I took an archaeological illustration, archaeological drawing course where we did a number of different kinds of drawings, did some section drawings, we did some plan drawings of trenches, we did a lot of artifact drawing, different techniques, so like those lizard tail hashes that you do for lithics, we learned how to do those. We learned how to dot stipple things for, say, ground stone, and different kinds of illustrations that one would use. And then I also went to Annapolis to take an archaeological photography course where we learned how to do the same sorts of things but with photographs. And always back then, the description, the rationale that I was given was that archaeologists do both of those. Always. We take photographs and we draw because they capture different kinds of information. And the photographs will capture colors. If you're taking color photographs, they'll certainly capture the shapes and the proportions of things very accurately. The drawings might not be quite so good on those things, but what they have is that layer of interpretation where the illustrator or the archaeologist who's doing the drawing stops and thinks about what it is that they're drawing. Is that really a boundary between, if you're doing a section drawing, is that really a boundary between one stratum and another stratum? Or am I imagining it? Is it just a trick of the light right now? You can put that in a photograph. It's frozen as whatever it was. So I was always taught that, the photographs are excellent and drawings are excellent, and don't even think about not doing both of them. But in their discussion, they start to get towards things in the 2000s and 2010s where some people are arguing that, oh no, structure from motion is good enough. Why would you bother illustrating when you can make great models with software? And that sat wrong with me when I read it, and it sat wrong with the authors, and they come to basically the same sort of conclusion that I just said. Why would you not do both things? Why would you not use whatever digital tools, mechanical tools are at your disposal so that you can take the human element in large part out of it? And why would you not also use the tools that absolutely insert the trained expert archaeologist into the interpretation and illustration of what it is that we're doing? So, I I got through the whole article and I thought, hey, that didn't change my opinion at all. They reaffirmed what I believe.
Yeah. Let me address what you just said real quick because, talking about doing both almost as a method of teaching. I actually, in my book, that's almost 4 years old now at this point, I have an article on mapping, and I have a chapter on mapping, I should say, and it's on compass and paste maps, and that's a common thing that we do to sitemap here over in the West. Is you do a compass and paste map, which simply means you start from the datum, whatever center point on the map, and you go north, and you drop a point on your graph paper for that datum. You go north, and you know what your pacing is. So for about 43 steps on even surface with no obstructions is 30 meters. So I can roughly get my pace based on that. And really, we're just looking for something that's to scale, honestly, for association of all the artifacts when you were drawing those maps. So I would go north to the site boundary, and then I would use my compass to draw another point from there. Usually I'd write a table of all these things, and they're basically vectors. And I would say, okay, now I'm walking at 94 degrees for 15 paces, and now from there I'm walking at 124 degrees for 13 paces, and so on and so forth. And I would draw my site boundary that way. And I would do the same thing, going vectors from the datum to different artifacts and different features, and that way you build your sketch map. And it can take a long time to build a sketch map that way, but nowadays we take the Trimble or some other sub-meter GPS with a graphical user interface, and using points, lines, and polylines, we go to each one of these things and we will record these things in very much the same way. We just have the device turned on rather than actually drawing with our pencil. Well, something I've noticed as someone who's been part of that transition from, I was on plenty of sites when we first came out in the West where one person did a sketch map and that same person also did a GPS map. And we were doing both on every single project because we were kind of in a transitional period as far as mapping with GPS goes. Everybody was pretty used to taking points with the GPS, but as far as creating an actual sketch map, if you will, that was born digital on the GPS, which they talk about here in the article, that was a transitional period. But the funny thing is, most of the people I saw that were required to do a sketch map at the same time would sit down in a shaded area next to the truck or a rock or something like that with the Trimble in one hand and their graph paper in the other hand, and they drew a sketch map based on the Trimble. Like they were getting distances, and they were doing the same thing they would do as compass and paste. They would say, what's the distance from this point to this point? And they were recreating that on paper. Talk about absurdity. But the thing that I noticed moving forward from there, when I got to projects where we weren't doing sketch maps anymore, we were just doing the Trimble sketch map, is that people who didn't go through that phase of drawing a map by hand and actually looking at the landscape and drawing those things in, they missed a lot of stuff. They didn't they didn't use the Trimble to record drainages or rock outcrops or anything unless you pointed that out to them. And they didn't really get the whole site topography down. They just did the site boundary, the features, and the artifacts, and that was it. And I was like, this is nothing. You need to add some more stuff to this. Whereas if you're hand drawing the map, a lot of times you'll put in, the other things that you would normally associate with hand drawing, like some contour lines and some shading and some stuff, and make it a little more artistic. So I think one thing this article is mentioning is the difference between sort of human intuition and doing it digitally. And I think that's where the digital method needs to come in and reproduce that human intuition. If we're just drawing lines and things like that, like you're doing points lines and polylines on a Trimble or with a total station or whatever, if you're just doing that, but you're not considering the artisticness of the whole thing and your actual mental human interpretation, that's where it kind of fails. But that being said, and I'll mention this later, I think we can do that digitally. You just need to do it right.
Well, I'm glad that you bring this up because I've got two different illustrations of how we used to use a combination of digital and pen and ink, frankly, though nowadays there would be no reason not to replace a pen and ink with something done on a tablet. But we'd use a combination of techniques in order to, I think, bring together the best of both worlds. So, again, I've mentioned that we built the surveying software. I'd used it on a number of different sites. We trained a bunch of different people on how to use it, but mostly I would do it for mapping architecture. I mean, I'd also obviously use it for laying out trenches and for doing contour plans and that sort of stuff. But if I was mapping architecture at the Great Temple in Petra, what we'd do is we would map block by block in top plan each stone that made up the temple as we were exposing them, as we were digging down through the trenches. It was in top plan. We recorded everything in 3D, so we could then rotate it around and we could see where the tops of the walls were. But then we'd print out those top plans nightly and paste them together because they were all on A4 paper. And hand those over to the excavators, who would then lay some tracing paper over the top, and they would add in details. They would, if something wasn't at the right level, if we recorded something incorrectly, if they wanted to show additional details like wear or cracks or whatever, they were able to do so. So they had what was generally a very highly accurate kind of skeleton underneath. And then they would add all those human bits on top, So at the end of the process, we wouldn't show off those total station maps that I created. What we'd show off were the maps that the excavators had done. And that was a much better way of representing the data and the progress of the dig. And then we actually went the other way at the very end, or actually a little more extreme, is that, I compiled all the top plans, all these walls and bits of floors and everything that I'd put together over years into an overall map of this huge structure. And it was a mess because it was block by block. You could see all these little details, and it just cluttered up the entire image. So, talking to an architectural historian, he's like, well, why are you doing that? Nobody cares really about the individual blocks on those walls. What they want to see is where the hell the wall is. So we we cleaned it up. So that it would just show the faces of the walls, and the walls would be gray while the floors would be white or some such, just to distinguish between them. So you ended up with a sensible, readable floor plan if you printed it out like on one sheet of paper in your journal. And then another way that we would use a similar sort of thing, where we'd build a skeleton to hand over to the excavators to add in details, is anytime we excavated mud brick. Mud brick is really, and this wasn't at Petra, this would be mostly in Yemen, but also work I did in Syria. Mud brick is a really malleable kind of building material people play with a lot. They'll knock it down, cut holes in it, add on, make additions and whatnot. But if the bricks kind of interdigitate at a corner, we say they bond. Mm-hmm. If one, so if we have two walls meeting at a corner and the bricks, interdigitate, the one row kind of overlaps the other one on the corner, they bond, and we know that those two walls were built as a unit. They were built at the same time. If, however, one wall just runs up and abuts another wall, then we say, it's not bonded, and we know that one wall was built after. They may have been part of the same design. They may have been built at pretty much the same time, but we know that they weren't, constructed as a unit. So that's something that we would do instead of drawing brick or mud brick by mud brick on mud brick architecture like we did block by block on the stone architecture of Petra. We would draw wall by wall the outlines of the walls and try to indicate as a surveyors where the bonds and the non-bonds were, and then then we'd print those out, and the excavators and the site architect could use those plans again for highly accurate framework upon which they would do, and they could interpret. They would look at what we said was a bond or a non-bond, and if we got it wrong, they would correct it there. But they reinserted that interpretive step into the process of generating the final publication quality maps. So
nice.
I'm really big on the digital collection, but I also love that secondary part, somebody else vetting what we've done and interpreting it and overriding it if they find that we've done it wrong. And so that step there, I think, is a lot like what you're talking about with the with GPS sketch mapping your site versus doing a manual sketch map. One, you can just say, oh, yeah, I got it. It's recorded in the computer. And the other one, you say, this is what I saw here. And that seeing is very critically important as an archaeologist.
Yeah, it is. And I have some comments on that as far as training goes. First off, I'd like to say the true value of that project for you and anybody else that was on it was for the rest of your life being able to casually drop in a conversation. When I was recording at Petra,
there I was hanging out in the Kazna at midnight.
That is the oh my god. All right, I think since we're so close to a break, let's just do that and then come back and record a full, maybe a little extra long segment and wrap up this conversation, because this is something we could probably talk about forever, and I definitely have some stuff that we want to get to. So let's do that and listen to this ad, and we'll be back in a second. Hey, podcast listeners. Do you find yourself wondering what the latest tablet or smartphone could do for your business? Wonder what GPS to pair with your device? Just trying to figure out how to go digital in the field without breaking the bank and or making a bad investment? Or did you find a technology company to work with but just aren't sure the questions you need to ask during the initial conversation? Well, you're not alone. There are literally thousands of tech combinations out there, and it can be really tough finding the right one for your business and your workflow. My name is Chris Webster, and I've been working in CRM since 2005, and I've been a tech enthusiast my entire life. I spend my time trying to figure out how to make archaeology more efficient both technologically and financially. No one is going to give you a big pile of money to do whatever you want with, so you have to make the most of what you have. The right gear can mean the difference between zero margins on that next project and an employee benefits package. That's where DigTech Concierge comes in. Let us be your technology guru. Whether you have just a few questions or want us on retainer 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, we're here to help. With years of experience, tens of thousands of acres of survey done completely digitally, and many, many people trained, DigTech is your tech BFF, just waiting to guide you through this process now and through the inevitable changes to come. Should you hold on to those tablets or upgrade? What about the new operating system? Will it crash your apps, or can you go ahead and do it? We know the answers and can guide you to a profitable year. Go to www.digtech-llc.com/tech-concierge to book a consultation or book us for the year. The yearly retainer includes unlimited calls and support and company training on software and gear. That's digtech-llc.com/tech-concierge. And concierge is CONCIERGE. To get going and go digital today. Call us before you make any decisions. We've been there before. All right, we are back for our final segment on Archaeotech episode 75, and as you noticed, we are skipping the App of the Day segment because there's just so much to talk about with this particular topic of artifact, not even artifact, but illustration in archaeology. So I think building on what we both said, Paul, something that I try to focus on, like I think I said at the end of the first segment, was I really try to look at doing everything digitally as much as I possibly can. Like, what can I do digitally? Because ultimately, that is going to be the way going forward. And I know that. Everybody knows that. We've all seen science fiction. We know everything's going to go digital, except for the first Star Trek, where back in the 60s, where they couldn't even conceive of tablets, and Kirk is still being handed a clipboard and a pen to sign shit with on the Enterprise. I love watching those old episodes and seeing that. Like, they had no concept of like tablets. But anyway.
Yeah, well, I already said in our episode about photography how I totally missed the boat on being able to take photographs on a tablet and annotate them right there. I was still talking about in 2007, 2008, when I was writing my dissertation, I was talking about taking Polaroids and taking a portable printer into the field in order to print out photographs and then annotate those. So, I'm not going to complain too much that they didn't catch that one in the late 60s.
Yeah, totally. Well, I want to talk about training because what you were mentioning is, really getting people to understand how to draw digitally, regardless of the app. There's plenty of applications out there that will allow you to either bring in a photograph or bring in some sort of media and essentially trace over the top of it. Honestly, if you're just drawing on a tablet and you're drawing on a grid on a tablet, you're doing it wrong. You're doing paper on glass, I like to say, which is basically just paper that's on a tablet. I mean, if you're not changing the way you're thinking and changing your workflow for this stuff, you need to think, as Doc Brown would say, fourth dimensionally, and think about the future and think about the fact that you're living in the future and you're not just drawing on graph paper that happens to be on a tablet. So anytime you're drawing, my thought is always snap a picture, bring in a picture, something into the tablet. Because I think we meld these two things together. I think in a perfect world, let's say you're drawing a profile of a unit or a wall or something like that. You're sitting in front of it. In most cases, if the personnel can be spared, that's a two-person operation, in at least in the work I've done in the United States. You set up a datum line that's horizontal on the vertical surface. And then somebody's basically just measuring along this datum line. They give you an XY coordinate, and they say, okay, I'm 10 centimeters down from the end, and I'm 15 centimeters up, draw a point. 13 centimeters down, 16 centimeters up, draw a point. And what they're drawing could be an artifact, could be a route, could be stratigraphy, could be whatever you think needs to go on the sketch map. And you're sitting there, and you're literally just to scale drawing these points, and then you're going to connect all the dots into a nice smooth line based on how you see it. And then later on, you'll add some shading, you'll add some stuff to make it look like it actually does look in front of you on the surface, so you can accurately represent that. The whole point is so we can learn from it later, because it's going to be backfilled, it's going to be destroyed, something like that. So we're trying to accurately represent. Well, people learn how to draw like that, right? People learned on your project in Petra, people learned how to draw on paper and using the methods they were doing. I think it's just about teaching people how to draw on a tablet. It's really a lot of the same skills now that tablets are really recreating paper well with certain apps and certain devices, like just to use the iPad as an example. If you have an iPad Pro with the Apple Pencil, my God, the lag time is in milliseconds, tenths of milliseconds. So you get a really accurate representation of what you're doing. You can do all the shading. If you get the right app with all the tools, you can do everything you can do on paper. You just have the thing in the background. I've drawn artifacts, I've drawn profiles, I've drawn site sketch maps, I've drawn all kinds of stuff on my tablet. And it's if you just don't think about it as paper and you think about it as just I'm just trying to recreate what I'm seeing in front of me, and you find the right app and the right tools to do that, then it should be okay. The whole Samsung Galaxy line of tablets as well with their S Pen, also very good and very detailed as far as recreating the pencil effect. There's a few things that you have to get used to, like the fact that there's no drag on a stylus, which is a little bit shocking sometimes. Like if you're, with a pencil, if I push harder or if I'm lighter, I can make different effects. You can do those things on the pressure-sensitive tablets, but there's no feedback. There's no tactile feedback that's actually dragging a little bit, which you just need to work your brain around that, really. But I don't know. What do you think about that, Paul? As somebody who did a lot of this, back when you were doing this, and as looking forward into the future, this should be a trainable skill, right? We should be able to recreate these exact same things and have our drawings be born digital, or am I wrong?
Oh, absolutely. I'm actually to briefly talk about the drag with the pencil. I asked my one of my coworkers, who's a very accomplished artist, and he uses an Apple pen on his iPad Pro quite a lot. I asked him if the tactile feel was a problem for him, and he said no. In his case, it wasn't. He thought maybe some people might have troubles, but he'd been drawing on various tablets for decade or more. Wacom tablets and that sort of thing. So it didn't really bother him. He really enjoys just the creativity he can do, because he can quickly switch out what the pen is, what kind of medium it's using, whether it's ink or pen or paint or whatever, and the kind of surface that it's emulating, that he can produce whatever he wants without having to think about that tactile feedback that he doesn't have, because he hasn't had that tactile feedback in most of the work he's had for quite a long time. So I think that's something that even somebody who went through decades of art school using traditional artist equipment can get past fairly quickly. So I don't think it's going to be a huge problem for most people. Again, you wouldn't really know until you try, though. I think that just like I think that photography and writing are intrinsic skills to conducting good archaeology, I think the drawing is as well. And then the tools, what I want to see is the digital tools improve the speed and the quality of the drawings more than anything else. I mean, just going digital itself isn't enough. For me, I'm happy enough if somebody has done a very good drawing on paper that we've scanned. That scanning then makes it deliverable digitally, which is extremely important to me, and archivable digitally and insertable digitally into reports, for example, or uploaded into databases, into the websites, and so on and so forth. That's where it becomes really important to me. I'm not so concerned about whether the capture is digital or not, but that said, like I was saying before, if we're using digital capture techniques, we can make things much better. We can do them faster. We can do them more accurately. And we then don't have to go through that rescanning step, which is a real pain. A lot of these drawing apps are going to allow you to actually do things with vectors. And vectors are fantastic because you can scale them like you can't scale rasters. You can scale rasters to a certain extent, but vectors you can go out, theoretically infinitely. And then they'll allow us to layer different kinds of media, different kinds of images, one up top of another, in a much more seamless way, so we can have richer illustrations of what we're digging, what we're finding, what we're doing as archaeologists. And I think that all is a net positive. But again, whether the capture itself needs to be digital, I don't know. I just think that, again, that's the way it's going. Might as well learn it. But if you have to teach somebody how to draw, it doesn't matter to me if it's going to be teaching them to draw digitally first or teaching them to draw on paper first, but teach them how to draw first. Yeah.
That is, that's absolutely the first thing that should be done, regardless of how you're doing it. I think addressing the digital later concept, basically, whether you're scanning it or whatever. I know a lot of companies it's just routine for them to take artifact sketches and other sketches and scan them and bring them into Illustrator and then tighten them up with Illustrator, right? I mean, Illustrator will look at it and create the line drawing and stuff like that, and then it's basically touch up. And I mean, as far as I know, I'm not too versed with Illustrator. I've used it a few times, but not enough to really be an expert on it. And as far as I know, Illustrator does a lot of the work for you if you have a nice high contrast drawing that you're bringing in, but then you have to go in and do some touch up. Well, just like, ancient manuscripts before the printing press where they had to copy things, errors happen. And as many, just like with digital transcription, we talked about digital archaeology in the beginning. Part of the problem with archaeology right now is that we know that the final product has to be digital. Right? So we know that we're turning in a report that's a Word document, or, it becomes a PDF. But for that to become that, we have to type up those words. And those words come from words that were written in the field on paper. And whether you could read somebody's handwriting accurately or not, maybe one word becomes another word, who knows? Maybe the person typing it up is not an archaeologist and they don't understand. And the same token, maybe the person who's doing, in fact, almost guaranteed, the person who's doing the illustrator work is not the person who drew that feature or artifact or whatever you're talking about. And there will be errors in the recreation of that drawing digitally, unless you can have the computer figure it all out 100%, and then you look at it and it looks right, then there's that. But there's always touch-up to do. And I just feel like the more steps you can take out of that process, the better. So trying to figure out how you're going to make this stuff born digital so then it doesn't need modification later on is always my goal. Trying to figure out how to do that. Yeah.
When I started at the museum as a very fresh-faced grad student, a big part of the project that we were doing, well, we had many projects there, but one of them was taking artifact illustrations that were being drawn by a professional artist that we had in our department. She would do pen and ink drawings, beautiful ones, gorgeously dot stippled, detailed pen and ink drawings. And this was in the days that flatbed scanners cost about $1,000, and so we would then scan those drawings, clean out the stray pixels, tidy them up a little bit, and then submit those for publication. A few years later, we were skipping the inking step and just going from the pencil drawings and basically inking things in computer programs, laying them down as a layer, and then tracing over them and adding the details at that point, which was a step better. It potentially ended up with a vector drawing at the end, just depending on the particular tools that we had, which meant that we weren't then locked to the resolution that we scanned them at, right? And then the next step, obviously, is foregoing the paper bit and just going straight to the electronic, so we don't have to have a separate digitization step, and doing publishable quality illustrations from start to finish on whatever computer device we have. So, but none of these are earth shattering. This is just a logical, sensible progression, and it's going to make for faster turnaround time as people get more comfortable with the particular tools. If they get more comfortable with Illustrator, say, there's no reason why one wouldn't start with Illustrator rather than starting with a paper and pencil scan or paper and pencil drawing, scanning that and then tracing over an Illustrator. So it will go in the right direction, and has been going in the right direction in my professional career.
Yeah.
So we'll see. I don't know where things are going to go from there. I mean, if it's already established, I'm not a very good futurist.
Yeah, it's to bring it back to the article too. In the last few minutes here. They mention, of course, in their lead up to kind of a where we are now statement, is they mention what's leading up to this is kind of the proliferation of digital photography, and then, of course, the lead on from that, which is 3D imaging techniques like structure for motion, photogrammetry, like you mentioned earlier, Paul. And then also they mention the use of GPS and total stations in creating born digital maps, which is another thing. And something that is interesting to me leading from both of those, though, is that they mention an example from Çatalhöyük where they've got a quote here where excavators are encouraged to trace rectified photographs on tablet screens instead of, quote, instead of struggling with manual drawing of an uneven surface. So they are progressing quickly over at Çatalhöyük, and I mean that's been an ongoing project for decades now, and just digging, and that's in Turkey for anybody that doesn't know, and just digging and trying to figure out with this mountain of data that they have how to make all this work with each other. The biggest problem I think they have in a long-term project is the back catalog. How often do you have to take, okay, we're doing this now we have to take all the old data and bring it into this standard. They're not really doing that as far as I understand. They just have stuff that they have to read in multiple different ways. So, but either way, it's nice that they're at least encouraging people to draw on tablets because they see at least the data storage capability of that versus having to store huge sheets of paper or lots of paper or something like that. And then one other thing they mentioned in the article that's kind of following along with all this is some people are saying, they're going full tilt the other direction and saying, why are we drawing anything at all when photoscan exists? Why aren't we just doing photogrammetry for literally everything? And on the one hand, if you had to pick one or the other, I kind of agree with that. because there is a long-term viability to that. The long-term viability of a drawing, whether that drawing is attached to the photograph forever, you have to assume that drawing will be divorced from the photograph at some point, because a photo was taken. It's 2018. But at some point, we're just going to be left with the drawing at some point when all that association is lost. And if that's the case, I would rather have the 3D photogrammetry model rather than the drawing if I had to choose one or the other, because in the future we might be able to extract a lot more information and a lot more data from that photogrammetry model that was created, that 3D model, than obviously from just a drawing or even just a simple photograph. I mean, as we mentioned in the last podcast, there's no reason why you can't take a popular tourist object and troll the internet for photos of it. As long as you can get the overlapping all the way around it, you can create a 3D model without ever actually going there. One that's highly accurate using these tools we have today. So I don't think drawing is going to go away anytime soon for some reason. I don't know. I still kind of just like it a little bit. I think it does help with interpretation somewhat. That being said, I'm not drawing on blank surfaces anymore. I'm highlighting basically what I'm seeing when I draw on a profile. When I mark out that stratigraphy, I'm just highlighting what my interpretation is saying as the person who's sitting in front of that wall, sitting in the field. This is what I'm seeing on the visual spectrum here on what we're looking at. And I think you're adding a bias when you do that, but I think you're doing it rightly so. And I think we should be adding some sort of a bias because we have training and experience and things like that rather than just a sterile photograph. So who knows?
Yeah, that brings up two things. One, as photography, as anybody who's ever done any serious photography knows, is not as objective as it's presented. There are plenty of ways to cheat the camera and to cheat the lighting and to highlight things or hide things. But even if it were totally neutral, bias isn't necessarily a bad thing if that bias is a kind of professional understanding of the materials that we're looking at, that we're working with, and is trying to intelligently and fairly highlight what we think is important about it. I think that's, we're humans doing work for humans about other humans. Why pretend that there's no human element to that? I think that that understanding it and embracing it is actually a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. Well, I'm interested to hear what you guys are doing out there. If you're listening to this show, have you tried digital illustration, digital drawing, whether it's artifacts or features or, what have you? And what's your experience with it? Are you still doing it? Are you using different apps? Let us know in the comments and let us know on Twitter. Let us know wherever you heard the show, and we'll figure that out. If you go to arcpodnet.com/archaeotech and type graphic in the sidebar there, you'll probably find out where I talked probably several times about the app Graphic for iPad and most Apple systems. It's just a fantastic. It's a vector drawing application, so keep that in mind. It does do some smoothing of lines, but I found that if you just adjust the settings, zoom way in, you can get a highly accurate drawing that you can then scale and do different things to, which is really cool. You can change the colors of individual lines. You can do all kinds of stuff in post that you just simply can't do with paper. And is also really difficult to do even with Illustrator later on if you create a vectored layered drawing with different things. So check that out and definitely check that app out. So I think that's just about all we have time for. Paul, any really quick final thoughts on this article? Should we throw away our tablets or throw away our paper? Which one? You get two choices.
I would throw away my paper if I had to throw away one or the other right now because I'm looking toward the future. But I don't think I would throw away either. I think they're both useful. Yeah. The one thing that we didn't really mention, the article itself, and I think deserves mentioning if somebody wants to go and read this article, is really, really focused heavily on things like site plans and stratigraphic sections, and only mentions kind of in brief, in passing, different illustrations of artifacts. And as you and I both know, we're not just drawing site plans and sections in the field. We also do a lot of artifact illustration as well, and that's its own set of techniques, its own kind of skill set, certainly its own what's the word I'm looking for? Standards and like if you're doing, for example, pottery sherds, geez, I'm losing my words at the moment. You're doing pottery profiles. There's accepted standards that one uses that pretty much only archaeologists use, but mean a lot to archaeologists. All of that stuff is absent from the article, and I don't think it's because they don't fully understand that this is also a serious part of archaeological illustration, but I think that it wasn't the focus of this article. So if you're looking to find out more information about that, this isn't the place to go.
Right. Indeed. Okay. Well, that was a good way to wrap up this segment. And again, links to the article are in the show notes, and let us know your thoughts. And I'm going to try to link to some of the Archaeotech episodes where we mentioned the app graphic and maybe some other stuff that's relevant. And other than that, thanks a lot, Paul.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for listening to the Archaeotech podcast. Links to items mentioned on the show are in the show notes at www.archpodnet.com/archaeotech. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com and paul@lugal.com. Support the show by becoming a member at archpodnet.com/members. The music is a song called Off-Road and is license free from Apple. Thanks for listening.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.